Late June 1945, 0540, Kadena Plain. Okinawa. Night rain leaves the coral dust clumped, and the canvas walls sweating as trucks from the U.S. 10th Army cough to a stop beside a field ward. Inside, 5 captured nursing orderlies of the Imperial Japanese Army stand rigid under bare bulbs, soot in the lines of their cheeks and iodine in the air, rehearsing the humiliation they were told would come. A generator hammers at the far end. A corpsman swings open a metal chest cooled by an ammonia compressor and stacks dented bowls on a folding table. The first shock is not a hand or a boot, but a smell. Milk, sugar, and clean cold where everyone expects kerosene and carbolic. A ladle works through a pale drift. When it falls, the ice cream lands soft against tin with a damp whisper. One woman flinches as if struck, then tastes. The cold stings the tongue, slides into emptiness, and for a heartbeat the ward's clatter recedes. Thermometers click against enamel. Pulse and temperature are recorded on stiff cards. Dressings are changed in orderly turns. Outside, loudspeakers mounted on jeeps repeat appeals for holdouts to surrender. Inside, the routine is stubbornly procedural, rations by table, not by favor. 10th Army surgeons sign transfer orders. A clerk notes each name for movement to a guarded enclosure before evening. The women watch the bowls melt at the edges and calculate anew what capture means. To explain how sweetness reached a battlefield whose organized resistance ended on 22nd June, the story must step back to the rules and logistics written years earlier that made such mercy possible, and to the indoctrination that insisted it could not be, August 1929. Geneva, while the world's diplomats still argued over tonnage limits for battleships and the price of wheat, a quieter document took shape, the Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Its clauses were neither ornamental nor vague. They required humane handling, medical care equal to that received by the detaining power's own forces, and rations comparable in quality and quantity to those eaten by the captors. In Washington, ratification meant work. The U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General and the Office of the Provost Marshal General began issuing circulars that would eventually harden into checklists for quartermasters and medical officers. In Tokyo, the paperwork found no such foothold. Japan did not ratify, and its military culture, shaped by Bushido and decades of rhetoric about the shame of surrender, treated capture as a moral failure. Still, dispatches in 1942 hinted that some provisions might be respected, though implementation varied wildly and could be undone by supply strain or ideology. By early 1942, as the Pacific widened into a killing ground, American planners turned treaty promises into logistics. Collecting points were diagrammed in training pamphlets. Escort ratios were defined so that squads knew how many rifles were required to move prisoners safely. Medical triage tables cross-referenced wounds with priority of evacuation. Subsistence standards referred back to quartermaster corps tables calibrated to caloric intake, not nationality or propaganda. Allied psychological warfare leaflets carried these standards into jungles and caves, promising food, medical care, and treatment under law. Garrisons on Rabaul and New Guinea dismissed them as tricks to soften resolve. The first real tests were small. In late 1942 on Guadalcanal, a handful of Japanese captives, some wounded, some delirious, were processed through aid stations that smelled of iodine and canvas, not revenge. Rumors traveled faster than landing craft. In the Aleutians in 1943, prisoners taken on Attu and Kiska were stunned by the monotony of bureaucracy. Names recorded, wounds dressed, rations issued. None of this aligned with Tokyo's newspapers, which insisted capture meant beatings or starvation. As the Central Pacific Drive advanced through the Gilberts and Marianas in 1944, the possibility of encountering women in uniformed medical roles increased. Their expectations were shaped by field reports of Allied flamethrowers and naval bombardment, not by stories of balanced rations and antiseptic wards. Yet American doctrine, hardened by treaty and institutional memory, remained procedural. Medical orderlies in U.S. units carried Field Manual 27-10 language that echoed Geneva, even if their opposite numbers had never read it. By early 1945, as the Ryukyus came into range, this discrepancy in expectation became more dramatic. Japanese indoctrination warned that surrender meant violation. American doctrine insisted that paperwork, thermometers, and balanced subsistence tables would govern. The collision of these two visions helps explain the disbelief that came later. With the legal scaffolding set, the next step turns toward the unlikely engine behind cold mercy and tropical heat, the industrial refrigeration and supply chains that followed the U.S. fleet island by island. August 1944, Noumea, New Caledonia, humid dawn clung to corrugated roofs as Liberty ships eased against piers and their insulated reefer compartments exhaled cold fog into air that normally smelled of diesel and pandanus. For the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, temperature was a weapon of morale and medicine, and its engineers spent years turning refrigeration into something predictable. Liberty and Victory ships mounted compressor-driven cold rooms whose ammonia coils whispered behind steel bulkheads. At island depots, the same technology nested inside prefabricated huts fed by gasoline generators that coughed through the night. Milk and eggs, fragile at the best of times, were plotted into convoy schedules alongside ammunition. When fuel arrived at a forward base, so did pallets of ice, packed in chipped blocks around insulated mess trucks that jounced toward field hospitals with canvas flaps tied tight against the heat. By early 1945, Saipan and Tinian hosted ice plants that churned day and night, their condensers licking salt air while Seabees shored up footings against typhoon rain. Navy tenders carried churns and powdered mix. When boiler pressure and deck space permitted, sailors took turns ladling out ice cream between watches. The gesture was not frivolous. Nutritionists noted that frozen dairy slid easily down throats burned by salt spray or dehydration, delivering calories and calcium without the labor of chewing. Psychologists in the medical department reported that cold desserts steadied nerves, lifting men who had stared too long at shell fire. The ice cream problem became shorthand in Quartermaster. Memos for a recurring priority: maintain frozen stocks even when tropical heat and fuel shortages conspired to melt. Morale. The system matured further when the Pacific Fleet commissioned a floating ice cream plant, a converted concrete barge moored in the Marianas with storage for thousands of gallons. Its refrigeration compressors, powered by diesel generators, fed a cold chain that radiated outward by boat and truck. Hospital coolers, sweating under canvas roofs, stocked metal tubs beside sulfur powder and plasma, the cold a reminder that logistics could defy climate. When wounded men arrived with cracked lips and fevered tongues, a scoop soothed the sting of salt and stabilized hydration where broth alone failed. For prisoners, the implications were different but governed by the same tables. Geneva-derived doctrine mandated equal subsistence, and quartermasters applied that rule with bureaucratic indifference. If a unit drew ice cream for patients, then captives under medical care, rank or nationality aside, could be issued servings when medically indicated. Nursing auxiliaries captured in the Marianas in late 1944 watched these routines with shock. The hum of generators and the metallic breath of ammonia coils contradicted every rumor printed in Tokyo newspapers. Their whispered confusion traveled across wards faster than the clatter of mess kits. On Okinawa in 1945, gasoline generators arrived stacked in the holds of attack transports, then spread to field hospitals near Kadena and Yontan. Chains of insulated containers linked pier to ward. Drivers logged temperatures on clipboards as though policing ice were akin to guarding ammunition. When captives appeared, rarely women, but sometimes attached to medical units, the system flexed without fanfare. Bowls were set, ladles dipped, and cold drifted into a climate that should have melted everything. With refrigeration established as both machinery and message, the narrative turns to the first encounters between these women and the Allied medical networks that reshaped their expectations on newly seized islands in 1944, June 15, 1944. Saipan, before sunrise, the western horizon strobed with naval gunfire, and by mid-morning, the reef-off red and green beaches crawled with LVTs pushing through surf that smelled of cordite and rotting coral. As Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions forced inland, the battle line bent around civilian settlements and improvised medical posts. Behind shattered walls and in coral caves, Imperial Japanese Army medical auxiliaries, some uniformed, others pressed from civilian clinics, waited under a doctrine that taught surrender meant shame. Many clutched field tourniquets and folded gauze. Few carried rifles. When the main defensive belts collapsed, patrols found these women huddled beside wounded soldiers, smoke-blackened and dehydrated. Their capture was swift, not ceremonious. Names were taken under the hiss of flamethrowers dying down, and ambulances rattled toward beachhead aid stations where canvas flapped like lungs in the trade wind. At those stations, triage obeyed categories inked in field manuals: immediate, delayed, minimal, expectant. Nationality was not one of them. Navy surgeons and Army nurses measured pulses, tagged fractures, and moved patients toward tented wards. Diet tables, derived from Quartermaster Corps standards, keyed soft diets to broths, canned peaches, and, when electricity held and ammonia coils stayed cool, small servings of ice cream. The cold soothed swollen tongues split by heat and fear. Captured auxiliaries, conditioned to anticipate slaps or hunger, instead received thermometers under the tongue and sutures placed with quiet efficiency. Interrogation teams later noted their disorientation. The process was impersonal, a bureaucracy rather than a spectacle. Through July, on Tinian's sugarcane fields and bomb-pitted villages, the pattern repeated. Women surfaced in pockets behind the advancing 2nd Marine Division, often alongside stretcher cases. Loudspeakers mounted on jeeps urged holdouts to surrender, promising food and medical care. Leaflets fluttered into ravines, their diagrams of rations and treatment tables dismissed by some as deception, but the evidence in wards spoke louder. Still, numbers remained small. Many Japanese units fought to annihilation, and suicides at coastal cliffs scarred the island's edge. In these islands, the template emerged: ferocious combat, then a widening cone of medical enclosures where refrigeration hummed against tropical heat and paperwork stacked in triplicate. Prisoners, men, and the rare women, moved through this machinery on rails of forms and fuel. When a chilled dessert landed on a tray under guard, it was not kindness, but procedure. As the drive shifted toward Iwo Jima and the sprawling defenses of Okinawa, the density of garrisons and strained hospitals made future encounters more likely, and the quiet contradictions of capture would sharpen in the Ryukyus. November 1944, Saipan. Rain drummed on tin roofs lashed to coral footings as the first comprehensive interrogation summaries crossed the desks of Allied intelligence officers. In them, the words of recently captured Imperial Japanese soldiers and the rarer women seized from aid stations were collated into neat paragraphs that smelled of carbon paper and disinfectant. What emerged was not boast or defiance, but bewilderment. Captives described meals issued according to schedule, medical dressings changed by rankless routine, and cold desserts ladled without comment. For personnel schooled in the belief that surrender invited torment, this indifference cut deeper than cruelty. Allied analysts annotated the margins: procedural feeding, chart morale lever. Within weeks, the psychological warfare branch began drafting leaflet text that echoed these reports, promising that names would be recorded, families notified when channels allowed, and rations allotted by table, not nationality. Through December, Nisei linguists, graduates of Camp Savage and the Military Intelligence Service Language School, polished the phrasing. Idioms were tuned to avoid arrogance. Kanji for care and food were placed beside diagrams of bowls and blankets. Loudspeaker trucks idled near ravines, projecting calm instructions into cave mouths, where fevered medics tried to staunch the wounds of collapsing divisions. Some Japanese intelligence summaries, captured later, warned troops not to be seduced by these enemy tricks, yet field officers occasionally conceded, quietly, that captured rankers described no beatings, only paperwork. Women auxiliaries yielded a different angle. Starved by siege caloric deficits and exhausted from sleepless dressing stations, they felt the physical thaw first. Broth eased throats raw from smoke. Chilled milk settled stomachs knotted by stress. Interrogators noted the psychological pivot. Those who had watched shells tear open wards now whispered, almost in disbelief, that American orderlies charted temperatures with the same monotony they offered to their own. These stories seeped back into tunnels and clinics via rumor, eroding certainties 1 teaspoon at a time. By January 1945, analysts in Hawaii plotted these impressions on briefing charts. Arrows traced how rumor spread, from ward to cave, from wounded to stretcher bearers. The paradox sharpened, doctrinal disbelief colliding with empirical observation. Japanese counter-propaganda doubled down, insisting that any appearance of mercy hid deeper humiliation, but the evidence from captives was stubborn. The Americans fed detainees with the same mindless regularity they fed themselves, a fact that no leaflet needed to exaggerate. As supply lines thickened and refrigerated barges nosed farther north, Allied planners sensed scale would soon magnify these contradictions. Okinawa's sprawling garrisons and overtaxed hospitals would place more women in the path of a cold chain that refused to melt, setting the stage for encounters where mercy sounded like the hum of a generator behind canvas. August 1944, Tinian, diesel haze clung low over the new hardstand airfields as Seabees pounded steel matting into coral, and behind the runways rose a quieter architecture of pipes, compressors, and insulated walls. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps measured progress not only by sorties launched, but by gallons of chilled liquid convincing heat to stand still. Ice plants sprouted beside island bakeries, their ammonia coils sweating against plywood bulkheads while generator sets thumped through the night. Crates of tinned milk, sugar, and powdered mix stacked behind barbed wire, logged by clerks whose pencils never stopped. On paper, refrigeration capacity was expressed in tonnage and gallons per hour. In practice, it meant a tented ward could requisition soft diets for men with burned mouths or shattered jaws, or for prisoners too frightened to chew. Reefer trucks, insulated with cork and fiberboard, rattled over coral roads toward tent cities that sprawled inland from the beaches, drivers marking temperatures on clipboards as if guarding ammunition. Through the winter of 1944-45, Guam's deep-water anchorage allowed supply ships to turn faster. Victory-class hulls offloaded pallets of dry ice, while diesel generators in prefab sheds drummed a steady baseline into the dark. Medical units learned to sync menus with the cold chain, pairing perishable days, when reefer trucks arrived, with broth and chilled milk, and falling back on canned fruit when weather or raids interrupted. The system tolerated little improvisation. Leaks in coolant lines meant lost calories. A generator out of fuel meant ward diet tables would tilt toward starch. Navy tenders moored offshore added capacity, their compressor rooms humming like distant beehives. When casualty lists surged, their cold tanks fed into beachhead coolers, expanding the refrigerated footprint just when fevers spiked. Japanese prisoners, men and the rare women attached to medical services, were processed into this network without ceremony. The same convoy that stocked a Marine chow line might deliver a tub of frozen dessert to a guarded clinic tucked behind a ridge line. Intake clerks never altered tables for captives. Geneva-derived doctrine tied subsistence to the captor's own ration scale. For auxiliaries whose indoctrination equated surrender with starvation, the metal bowl sweating on a canvas cot felt irrational. Interrogators noted that confusion often preceded relief. Calories loosened shoulders long clenched by siege diets. By March 1945, as ships massed for the Ryukyus, the Pacific's refrigerated heartbeat quickened. Amphibious schedules tightened, and quartermasters trimmed transit times for perishables to hours rather than days. The Navy's floating ice cream, barge, and reefer-equipped tenders extended reach beyond coral harbors, roaming where island plants could not. On charts in logistics tents, arrows of cold extended north while casualty projections climbed. What landed as a pale scoop in a tin bowl was simply industrial physics expressed in nutrition tables: fuel, compressors, and manpower converging. With island ice made routine, the story now turns to the fleet solution that amplified output at sea and followed the assault waves into the teeth of Okinawa's defenses. March 1945, Ulithi Atoll. Lagoon water lay glassy under a pale morning, as a concrete-hulled barge, reflagged and refitted, rode at anchor amid a forest of masts. Its shape was ungainly, but below its reinforced deck thrummed compressors tied to diesel generators that drank fuel by the barrel. This was the Pacific Fleet's floating ice cream plant, $1 million wartime dollars made solid, and its mission was measured in gallons per hour. Engineers had stripped cargo holds and installed insulated tanks, chiller coils, and stainless churns capable of producing thousands of gallons between resupply cycles. Production logs recorded turns of mix, draw temperatures, and storage capacity the way gunnery officers tracked ammunition. By rendezvousing with tenders and transports, the barge pushed cold outward, tub by tub, to carriers, battleships, destroyers, and advance bases whose morale had long since been boiled thin by humidity and fatigue. On hospital ships, dietitians read those cold tables like doctrine. Patients whose mouths were burned by salt spray, fever, or shock received soft, calorie-dense servings that passed without chewing. In shore wards, Navy corpsmen lifted insulated lids from tubs sweating in tropical heat, sliding bowls beside sulfa powder and plasma. The gesture was clinical as much as comforting. Psychology reports noted improved appetite and hydration in casualties served chilled dairy rather than starchy rations alone. Quartermasters tied these outcomes to fuel and compressor uptime, charting recovery curves that rose and fell with generator output. When ammunition ships anchored nearby, the barge could refuel and ramp production. When typhoon winds shredded tent rows on Okinawa, cold chain recovery was timed in hours as generators restarted and refrigerant pressures stabilized. To enemy eyes, when news of such a vessel filtered through, interrogation rooms and rumor the machine represented a contradiction. Japanese indoctrination taught that surrender guaranteed torment. Yet here was proof of an adversary rich enough in energy, sugar, and milk to freeze comfort at sea and distribute it according to paperwork rather than passion. For the rare female auxiliaries taken near forward dressing stations, a sweating metal bowl placed under guard implied a bureaucracy whose mercy was industrial, not sentimental. Even air raids could not easily break it. Overlapping cold nodes on islands and ships ensured redundancy. Compressors at Guam, Saipan, and afloat at Ulithi overlapped like armor plates, so that when one line faltered, another fed the wards. By late April, as the fleet fanned north toward the Ryukyus, refrigerated tenders loitered behind the gun line, shuttling frozen stock to fire-scarred beaches where casualty tents multiplied. The barge's humming heart synchronized with island ice plants, extending the cold chain into contested waters. What looked like frivolity in headlines was, in practice, the metabolic infrastructure of a grinding campaign. Each ladle of frozen dairy represented diesel burned, coils cooled, and logistics officers tallying outputs beneath red lamps. As bombardment intensified around Okinawa's Shuri line, this convergence of floating and island-based refrigeration created the backdrop for the largest interactions between Allied medical systems, civilians, and the handful of female prisoners who emerged from tunnels and collapsed wards. There, beneath canvas, cold bowls would land on tin trays beside triage tags, setting the stage for the most intimate collision between expectation and procedure. February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima. Just after dawn, the air cracked under overlapping batteries, volcanic grit drifting like smoke across the landing beaches as Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions clawed forward through ash that swallowed boots to the ankle. Casualty stations sprouted along the lee of terrace walls, canvas pinned low against the blast. Here, the medical routine began its relentless cadence. Intake tags clipped to torn fatigues, sulfa sprinkled into wounds, morphine syrettes logged by number. Prisoners were vanishingly rare. Most Japanese chose death behind pillboxes. But those routed from collapsed tunnels met an unexpected bureaucracy. Records were taken under the same red pencils that charted marine fractures. Ration cards were issued like distant promises, and stretcher teams hauled the injured toward beachward evacuation. By late February, as the fight cramped around Mount Suribachi and the northern ridges, refrigerated chests appeared in aid stations carved into ash berms. Their ammonia coils sweated in air that tasted of sulfur and cordite. Inside waited soft diet items, broths, custards, canned fruit, and, when generators held steady, tubs of ice cream ladled into metal bowls that sweated faster than the men who carried them. For Japanese medical orderlies captured near collapsed dressing stations, the sight of cold food cracked certainty. Indoctrination had forecast torment and starvation. Instead, nurses worked with procedural neutrality, pulses checked without comment, fevers coaxed down by calories that slid easily past clenched jaws. Early March shifted the stage. Hospital ships and LSTs ferried the wounded to Karama-Reto, where anchorages thickened with white-hulled wards. There, medical supply officers mapped perishable flows onto charts pinned beneath red lamps. Insulated cans rode jeeps ashore. Then reefer trucks rattled up gravel to tent lines waiting for Okinawa's mass intake. Captured personnel, still mostly men, were processed inside this chilled lattice. Thermometers came first, then meal codes. Soft diets arrived at appointed hours, not as reward but schedule. The neutrality was disorienting. Interrogators noted that even the suspicious swallowed more once served something cold. These weeks proved scalability. Under bombardment and volcanic ash, fleets could feed delicately, and paperwork could keep pace with blood loss. Female presence on Iwo was limited, setting a baseline against which later encounters would sharpen. Karama-Reto's harbors thrummed with compressors as April approached. Convoys plowing north toward Okinawa's denser garrisons, schools turned hospitals, and the presence of student nurse auxiliaries already fraying under siege. With perishable routes rehearsed and cold chain nodes overlapping, the next landfall would test promises inked in 1929 against indoctrination hammered into childhood. Ahead lay wards where women braced for punishment and instead found a sweating metal bowl and a clipboard tracking their pulse. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa L-Day. Dawn broke against a gray ceiling of low cloud as the first waves of the U.S. 10th Army landed on Higuchi beaches. Surf slapping against steel ramp doors and the sour smell of cordite drifting inland from naval bombardment. Within days, the battlefield widened into a maze of ridgelines and ravines that funneled casualties toward a sprawling medical lattice. Evacuation hospitals unfurled canvas wards along coral roads. Clearing stations clustered near ammunition dumps. Captured civilian clinics, now under guard, treated the unarmed and the unwilling side by side. Tens of thousands of wounded passed through this network by May, and among them were rare but telling groups of women, student nurse auxiliaries pulled from nearby schools, and a handful of Imperial Japanese Army, medical orderlies who emerged gaunt from caves, shattered by satchel charges. Intake made no ritual of their presence. Thermometers slid under tongues. Pulse rates were scribbled on triage tags, iodine-stung wounds that smelled of smoke and mold. Diet assignments followed quartermaster corps tables. Soft diets for fever, broths for stomach wounds, canned fruit for dehydration. When generators stayed fueled and compressors held pressure, the soft diet menu expanded. Corpsmen lifted insulated lids to reveal chilled milk or a pale drift of ice cream, ladled into metal bowls that began sweating instantly in the tropical air. The bucket did not discriminate. It passed from American cot to guarded prisoner row without ceremony, a bureaucratic rhythm that bewildered women raised on catechisms of cruelty. Some stared before tasting, expecting blows that never came. Others swallowed quickly, calories unknotting stomachs cramped by weeks of siege rations. interrogation summaries from mid-May noted a tonal shift. Once stabilized, detainees described American treatment as methodical rather than performative. Names recorded, wounds dressed, meals issued on schedule. Intelligence officers annotated these reports under red lamps, recognizing their value. Loudspeaker trucks idled near ravine mouths, broadcasting promises of food, water, and medical care according to international law, phrasing sharpened by Nisei linguists. Surrender cards dropped by air-illustrated processing steps and ration scales. Diagrams of bowls and blankets printed beside kanji for care. Each week, rumors moved faster than patrols, whispering that capture meant paperwork instead of torment. By June, as organized resistance collapsed around the Shuri line, tents and fenced enclosures remained full. Field hospitals shifted from shock to maintenance, cooling fevers and managing infections under canvas roofs that snapped in monsoon gusts. Refrigeration assets, battered by typhoon squalls, recovered in hours as generators rebooted and ammonia lines recharged. The same routines that delivered cold sweetness on Okinawa would soon flow into occupation logistics. Mass processing camps, hospital ships shuttling detainees to rear areas, and staging facilities where warfare dissolved into forms, transport lists, and diet tables. Ahead lay a transition from battlefield to bureaucracy, where the metal bowl and the clipboard would follow prisoners far beyond the sound of guns. June 1945. Okinawa, night rain hissed against canvas and turned coral dust to paste as a line of guarded cots in a field ward settled into the low murmur of thermometers, clipboards, and labored breathing. For the female prisoners brought here, student nurse auxiliaries scraped from cave hospitals, or the few imperial medical orderlies pulled from collapsed dressing stations, the greatest shock arrived quietly. No faces softened, no voices warmed. Instead, care unfolded with the impersonality of law, pulse counted, fever charted, diet assigned. Years of instruction had promised that capture would unmake the body and stain the soul, that American hands would strip honor by force. Yet when the insulated lid lifted and a ladle tapped metal, what fell into tin bowls was cold, sweet, and weighed according to a table printed long before these women took their oaths. Suspicion came first. Prisoners stared at the pale smear sweating in the tropical heat, tasting slowly as if testing a trap. Guards watched, not hovering but ensuring the routine stayed routine. Calories slid into stomachs knotted by siege diets. Shoulders loosened. Over days, the shock settled into dissonance. Procedure pressed against propaganda, and procedure did not blink. Nurses checked sutures on prisoners and Americans in the same round. Corpsmen, exhausted, sunburned, half-deaf from artillery, moved bucket and ladle between rows without ceremony. Among Allied personnel, the rhythm mattered, too. Feeding enemies underlined a sense of procedural morality at a moment when brutality elsewhere threatened to numb judgment. It reminded orderlies that the Geneva-derived chain of treatment was a discipline, not charity. Medical officers understood the practical dividend. A fed, cooled prisoner remained coherent longer, less prone to collapse or delirium during questioning. Intelligence teams scheduling interrogations noted that the first full soft diet meal often yielded clearer recollections and steadier handwriting on statement forms. Rumor seeped outward from these wards like groundwater through limestone. Newly captured orderlies whispered into the dark that Americans followed charts rather than passions. Leaflets dropped into ravines emphasized rations and water points, their diagrams echoing the bowls and blankets seen under canvas. Loudspeaker trucks voiced promises of medical care and predictable meals, shaped by Nisei linguists who tuned phrasing to avoid arrogance. Civilians and auxiliaries, already brittle from hunger, sometimes edged forward when the next shelling lulled, surrender cards clenched in damp fists. Frontline infantry, bound tighter to Bushido and command fear, remained harder to move. But intelligence logs recorded a trickle of capitulations traced to stories of food rather than threats. By midsummer, the psychological pattern gelled: suspicion, guarded consumption, reluctant acceptance, and a cautious recalibration of what surrender meant. The sweet detail served as proof of policy, not sentiment. It signaled that the detaining power obeyed its own written rules even when no one watched. And as Japan reeled under bombardment and news of Okinawa's fall, this correction in expectations fed directly into the operational push to coax holdouts from caves alive. Ahead, the war's final months would test how far calories, procedure, and paperwork could bend a doctrine that had promised only flames. July 1945, Okinawa. Dawn pooled gray in the mouths of caves gouged into limestone as loudspeaker trucks crept forward, their engines ticking in neutral. The voices they projected promised food, water, bandages, and predictable rations, according to international law. Weeks earlier, such claims would have dissolved against doctrine and fear. Now, however, interrogators' reports, some drawn from female auxiliaries taken at dressing stations, described intake routines that matched the script with maddening precision. Temperature taken, pulse recorded, soft diet issued, clipboard signed. Inside the ridges, rumors fermented. Civilians and medical orderlies whispered of cold desserts and broth ladled on schedule, not whim. Propaganda lines that once seemed steel began to flex in the heat. Tactically, this mattered in the margins. As July deepened, small knots of non-combatants and stretcher-bearers edged out under improvised flags. Patrol logs showed more surrenders in the campaign's final weeks than in its opening, particularly in areas where leaflet drops overlapped with interrogator testimony. Every group spared the torch-saved hours of demolition work and kept flamethrower fuel for targets that would not yield. Platoon leaders, racing a calendar measured in typhoons and casualty projections, marked each quiet capitulation like a gift. The soft diet ladle and the sweating cold chest, though tiny in footprint, became emblems of predictability, a bureaucratic gravity pulling the hesitant across lines chalked in coral dust. Strategically, the effect rippled. Intelligence analysts noted fewer last-ditch suicides in pockets where surrender cards circulated and where captives' accounts reached cave mouths. That meant fewer booby traps, fewer demolitions, fewer dead civilians. Commanders leaned on this persuasion toolkit as naturally as they tasked artillery and armor. Words could point to bowls and bandages already waiting behind the wire. For women raised on promises of defilement in defeat, the impersonality of care, its measured calories and neat signatures, proved more subversive than kindness. It suggested an enemy bound not by passion, but by procedure. In Tokyo's crumbling bureaucracy, propaganda lines held firm even after Okinawa fell, but post-war memoirs and oral histories would reveal the dissonance, a doctrine of endless torment undone by a sweating metal bowl in a canvas ward. When Japan's formal surrender loomed in mid-August and was signed on 2nd of September 1945 aboard the USS Missouri, the theater pivoted from flames to forms. Mass processing camps, repatriation staging areas, and hospital ships amplified the very routines rehearsed on Okinawa. Compressors hummed louder in occupation ports. Cold chain nodes multiplied. Diet tables followed prisoners and civilians alike, from battlefield corrals to harbor sheds. Ahead lay paperwork instead of pillboxes, transport lists instead of tunnels, proof that the smallest comforts, industrially delivered, had helped coax the war's last holdouts into the open. June 1945. Okinawa. Monsoon gusts snapped guy ropes and drove rain sideways through canvas seams, puddling beneath cots where diesel generators coughed thin and tired. Along some ridge lines, the cold chain faltered. Fuel convoys stalled in mud. Compressor pressures dipped. Insulated chests warmed into useless boxes that smelled faintly of sugar and ammonia. In those hours, medical officers fell back on broths, crackers, and canned fruit, stepping menus carefully for prisoners whose stomachs had shrunk under siege diets. The system was never universal, nor always gentle. On days when the front collapsed in spurts of flame and shrapnel, guards arrived at wards half-deaf and shaking, and rough handling did occur in the crush of mass intake. Interrogation summaries noted that some women taken from caves refused food at first, suspecting poison or humiliation. Others gagged on rich dairy after weeks of scarcity. Adaptation became doctrine. Liquids first, then thin porridges, then soft sweets, always under watch for nausea or collapse. Supply shocks tested improvisation. When fresh milk vanished under typhoon waves, powdered mixes took its place, whisked into stainless vats with water hauled from chlorinated drums. Cold capacity shifted like armor plates. Refrigerated trucks rerouted toward wards expecting mass casualties, leaving chow lines to lean on dry stores. Prejudice lurked at the edges. In some commands, extra scrutiny of Japanese captives slowed paperwork compared to European theaters, bitterness codified in caution. But field surgeons learned to keep enemy and allied lines moving without spectacle, mindful that public shame could compound trauma and spark panic. Courtmen rationed ice by patient temperature, not rank. Even when the headline dessert appeared, pale, sweating in a tin bowl, it was a contingency, not a promise. Typhoons or fuel shortages could erase it by dusk. That fragility matters. It reveals procedure, not sentiment, as the backbone of mid-1945 care, where compressors hummed, calories slid past clenched teeth. Where they failed, warm broth filled the gap. These edges guard against easy myth. The story's truth lies in paperwork that refused to break, even when canvas did. With limits admitted and improvisations mapped, the narrative follows these routines toward their final wartime act. Occupation staging grounds, hospital ships idling in repatriation harbors, and the routinized mercy that carried prisoners, women among them, from battlefield enclosures into transport lists. Pier sheds and eventually homeward decks once Tokyo conceded the end. September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay, aboard the USS Missouri, the surrender signatures dried in humid air while across the Pacific, the battlefield's machinery pivoted from assault to administration. In Manila, Guam, and Okinawa, processing centers sprouted beside piers and airstrips, their canvas halls lined with filing tables where clerks sorted Japanese personnel into medical, civilian, or repatriation channels. Among them passed the rare female members of Imperial Medical Services, exhausted and blinking at a world that had continued to run on forms. Hospital ships ghosted through anchorages, their cooled wards lit dimly against tropical nights. Compressor plants on Army and Navy installations ashore ticked like metronomes, feeding cold rooms and ice chests. The menu regularized further: soft diets for the fevered, canned fruit for the dehydrated, milk-based desserts when diesel and refrigerant held. Each bowl traced to a ledger line, calories accounted as scrupulously as morphine syrettes. For prisoners who had braced for punitive rations, occupation cemented a realization formed in canvas wards. The system would end the war as it had fought it, by its own rules, indifferent to the drama of individual fear. Interrogators scheduled interviews in minutes, not moods, preferring cool rooms that prevented collapse. Some detainees, women included, left their cots with a memory tilted by shame and relief, a guarded kindness logged by a clerk whose pen never paused. These impressions bled into early post-war narratives, complicating caricatures on both sides. Occupation planners, suddenly responsible for feeding millions in devastated cities, drew lessons from island wards where calories, not sentiment, stabilized crowds. Relief shipments of powdered milk and canned goods traced the same logic that once ladled sweetness into tin bowls. As transports loaded for repatriation in late 1945, the administrative machine hummed on piers slick with condensation, closing a circle begun in smoke-filled caves. Beneath it all lingered the quiet defiance of a metal ladle in a hot ward, proof that moral arithmetic could be industrial and still matter. Bowl by Sweating Bowl, August 1945. Okinawa, evening light slants low across canvas walls patched from months of monsoon gusts, and the ward's generator hums with a softer timbre now that casualty lists have thinned. Cots stand farther apart. Triage tags no longer bloom in frantic colors. Yet memory remains precise for the women who once lay here, student nurse auxiliaries pulled from cave hospitals and corridors of collapsing wards. They recall the texture of volcanic dust on their tongues, the doctrine that promised capture would strip honor and flesh alike, and then, impossibly, the cold breath of a metal ladle lifting from an insulated bucket. The first bite tasted like contradiction, sweetness when every lesson promised a blow. What endured was not sentiment but procedure. Calories logged in ledgers, diet codes penciled beside pulse rates, compressors cycling through tropical nights because a treaty written years earlier demanded humane subsistence. Americans did not feed prisoners to win hearts. They fed because their own law demanded it, and their logistics could sustain it. For these women, terror pivoted into wary watchfulness, then into a quiet arithmetic of days until repatriation. The fires of the Pacific War were not doused by a bowl, but in this hot ward, stubborn enforcement of routine held where vengeance might have felt easier. It was policy expressed as temperature, sugar, and time, small things delivered on schedule. Outside, trucks rattled toward docks where ships wait to spirit the wounded and the captured to staging grounds. Inside, the ward exhales. The story returns to a mouth startled by cold sweetness, a detail that meant nothing grander than calories and routine, and yet, in that humid summer, meant everything about what capture would and would not be.